Peyton Manning is probably the greatest regular season quarterback of all time. He won a record 5 MVPs, made a record 7 All-Pro first teams, set the single season record for passing yards and touchdowns, and led the NFL in passing success rate a mind-boggling 8 times in a decade span. In many ways, his regular season resume is unmatched. But for much of his career, Peyton's playoff reputation was dramatically different. He was seen as an underperformer, someone who shrunk when it mattered most. That is, of course, until he won his first Super Bowl, and then with his second, cemented his playoff resume too, proving himself by delivering on the biggest stage. Well, that's the narrative, of course. But is that what really happened? No, not at all. In reality, Peyton's numbers across his 2 Super Bowl runs were, well, awful. What's more, his numbers across all his other playoff runs, the ones in which his team didn't win at all, for which he was panned as a playoff dropper, well, they're actually pretty good. By every statistical measure, Peyton played far worse in the Super Bowl runs than in the rest of his playoff career. He threw for much less yardage and did so much less efficiently. He threw for far fewer touchdowns and turned the ball over more frequently. But how is this possible? How could his individual playoff performance have an inverse relationship with his team winning Super Bowls? Well, it all comes down to one number that Peyton has absolutely nothing to do with. In all of his other playoff runs, Peyton's defenses allowed 23.9 points per game. In his 2 Super Bowl runs, they allowed just 14.6. That's your explanation right there. If you're a devout Nerd Sesh follower and you've already heard me mention those numbers a handful of times in recent weeks, I apologize. I've been working on this video for a while, and perhaps I blew my wad a bit prematurely there by citing these numbers repeatedly before the big reveal in the intro there, but I just haven't been able to stop thinking about what a perfect microcosm they are for the thesis of this video. We treat Super Bowls as the ultimate accomplishment for a quarterback and as a good measure of his individual greatness. But I fundamentally and strongly disagree with that notion. Because how can that possibly be right when Peyton Manning exists, an all-time great who didn't win it all when he was at his best, but did win it all when he was at his worst? Like, of all years, it was in 2015 that Peyton won a Super Bowl, when he flat out sucked, not just in the playoffs, all year. He was 39 years old and crippled by a body that had completely degraded after a series of major injuries. In the regular season, he threw for 9 touchdowns against 17 picks and was benched for Brock Osweiler. In the Super Bowl, he had 104 net yards and 2 turnovers, one of the worst quarterback playoff performances of the last decade plus by EPA per play, and yet his team won. Trent Dilfer and the 2000 Ravens offense performed better than Peyton Manning and the 2015 Broncos offense did. At that moment, Peyton was probably playing at the lowest level of any quarterback to ever win the Super Bowl, purely carried by an all-time great defense. And I think most people understand that Peyton was really bad in 2015, but nevertheless, I do believe his legacy and reputation is helped by that second Super Bowl, bad as he was individually. And what's more often overlooked is how bad he was by his standards in the 06 run. He had one good performance in a memorable duel against Tom Brady and the Patriots, but had more turnovers than touchdowns in all of the other 3 games in that run. But I promise, I'm not trying to shit on Peyton here at all. It's just so perfect that one of the greatest quarterbacks ever played at an all-time great level for so long and yet fell short of a Super Bowl so many times, but actually won it all as he struggled mightily. This, my friends, is football for you, because like any win in the NFL, a Super Bowl is a team accomplishment. It can happen because of great quarterback play or in spite of poor quarterback play, just like a loss can happen in spite of great quarterback play or because of poor quarterback play. Despite our obsessive romanticization of the quarterback as the most important figure in sports, football is the ultimate team sport. 53 players on the roster, 22 starters over two sides of the ball, 3 phases of the game, a robust coaching staff that matters much more than it does in any other sport. A quarterback is simply one part of the winning formula, a big one, of course, but not as big as we might often think. So the reality is that Super Bowls are vastly overrated when it comes to how we measure and discuss individual quarterbacks. And when it comes to proving that point, Peyton Manning is just the beginning. Allow me to play a little game with you guys. On this graphic, we have the playoff stats of 4 great quarterbacks, with all of their totals presented as 17-game averages, just because they're easiest to read as a direct per-game comparison like that. Also, these are total yards and touchdowns, so they include rushing production along with passing. 3 of these mystery quarterbacks have combined to win 2 Super Bowls, which is often held against 2 of them in particular, who some malign as playoff underachievers accordingly. The other quarterback has 7 Super Bowls and is almost universally considered the greatest playoff performer ever. So yeah, one of these guys is Tom Brady. But can you guess which one? I mean, surely we can identify him easily here, given the massive gap in playoff reputation between him and the others. So which one's Brady? That's right. The guy with the fewest yards per game, the fewest touchdowns per game, the second most turnovers, the lowest passer rating, and the second fewest points scored per game. Now, let me be very clear. Brady's playoff numbers are excellent. But the other guys, Josh Allen, Drew Brees, and Aaron Rodgers, whose numbers are just from his time in Green Bay, by the way, because I gathered them before these playoffs, have bottom line numbers that are objectively more excellent. If you were to blindly draft players based on these per game playoff numbers, Brady would go last. So how is it possible then that he has had so much more team success in the playoffs? How does he have 7 Super Bowls to their 2 combined? Once again, there is one very revealing number that these players have nothing to do with: the points allowed by their defense, where Brady's teams completely lap the field up against Bills, Packers, and Saints defenses that repeatedly struggled in the playoffs. But okay, let's apply more context. Let's take a look at these guys' numbers in playoff losses so we can specifically look at when their teams fell short and identify who was responsible for that. We're going to play our game again because it's just so fun. Here are the numbers. Anybody got a guess for which one's Brady? That's right. I actually didn't even move them around on this graphic because I'm lazy and pathetic, but he's the guy with the second fewest yards per game, the fewest touchdowns per game, the most turnovers, by far the worst passer rating, and by far the least productive team offense. By the way, as one more data point, I conveniently saw this graphic as I was making this video, which shows quarterback performance in playoff losses by EPA per play and their defense's performances. And Josh Allen is quite an outlier here. Of all 32 quarterbacks on this graph, Allen performed the second best by EPA per play, but his defenses performed the worst of anybody's. And then we also have Aaron Rodgers firmly here in the good quarterback performance, bad defense quadrant. And Drew Brees also generated more EPA per play in his team's playoff losses than Brady did. So it's not just the bottom line numbers. In playoff losses, Brady's numbers are clearly worse than the other 3. All the while, by the way, his team's defenses actually still allowed fewer points than all of theirs did in the defeats. Now, with all this out there, I want to be clear, bottom line numbers aren't everything. There's context for all these numbers. Situational excellence is super important, and Brady was more situationally clutch than any of these guys, and perhaps more so than any other quarterback in history. His 14 playoff game-winning drives double Patrick Mahomes in second place, who is, of course, still adding to his total. So, all things considered, I still believe Brady is a better playoff performer than the other 3. However, it's a lot closer than you might think. Certainly closer than what would be indicated by him having 5 more Super Bowls than the other 3 combined, right? The other 3 have produced excellent individual numbers and elite team offense. And of course, they're only responsible for their own production and the offense. Bottom line numbers may not paint a perfect picture of quarterback performance, but they certainly paint a much better one than pure wins and losses. Because what happens on defense is entirely out of a quarterback's hands. And as we saw, the real statistical difference between Brady's teams and the others is the defensive help he received. And that's where, as much as I credit Brady for his brilliant clutch execution, context is needed again. Because to be deemed clutch is something of a privilege in the NFL. What do I mean by that? Well, to be clutch, you first need an opportunity to be clutch, which requires that your team at least allow you, if not push you, to be in that position in a very close game. Take Brady as an example. Do you know how many points per game his defenses allowed across the 14 playoff games in which he led a game-winning drive? 20.8. On average, that's not a very high bar to clear, right? In other words, often it was stellar team defense that kept his team in the games and gave him the opportunity to finish things off with one clutch drive without having to go toe-to-toe in a shootout for 4 quarters. Specifically, on a young Brady's first 3 playoff game-winning drives, he led his team to finish with 16 points, 20 points in a game in which they had a return touchdown, and 17 points. Not particularly strong offensive performances at all. So in those games, if he just had an average defense, he likely wouldn't have had the opportunity to be clutch at all. He simply would have had to score more points to win the game. Had they lost, scoring 16, 20 with a return touchdown, or 17, it's the offense that would have been blamed. But a win changes the framing on everything, even if the only real difference is how the defense played. Now, Brady did lead 4 game-winning drives in the playoffs in which he got his team to 30 points or more, which is phenomenal and quite memorable. Like, the guy was unbelievable, of course. But he was never asked to live in those situations like Allen, Rodgers, or Brees, and that changes a lot. Time and again, Brady didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be clutch. Many great quarterbacks don't have that luck. Yet, ironically, one of Brady's best ever performances came in a loss in the 2017 Super Bowl, the rare instance in which his defense could not get the stop they needed against the overwhelming power of Big Dick Nick. And Brady did everything he could have. He was sensational, but it still wasn't enough. Such is the reality for a quarterback. At some point, any great quarterback will probably be carried by and let down by the team around them, because it turns out the other 52 guys matter a ton. To be clear, nothing I'm saying in this video is meant to disparage Brady. He is the GOAT. What I'm trying to highlight is that the perceived gap in per game playoff performance between him and the others is much larger than the actual gap, because those other 3 had some bad luck around them, and because Brady is not just the greatest, but also the most fortunate quarterback of all time. Brady's longevity is an unparalleled marvel, and it was also paired with an unparalleled run of organizational and defensive brilliance, primarily fueled by the greatest defensive mind to ever live, Bill, not first ballot Belichick. In 21 years as a starter, Brady played with 17 top 10 scoring defenses and 9 top 5 units. In 70 total years, Rodgers, Brees, Peyton, and Marino combined played with 19 top 10 scoring defenses and 10 top 5 units. The defensive help Brady got every single year, Brees or Rodgers might get once every 5 years. That makes a gargantuan difference when it comes to winning games in, a team sport. Dramatically increasing the margin you have on your side of the ball, lowering the burden of what you have to do to get a win every time. Brady only had to throw 1 touchdown in the entire 2001 Super Bowl run. In 2003, the Patriots won it all despite the fact that their offense ranked 19th in points per drive. Without the best defense in the league, they might have missed the playoffs entirely that year. And twice in the Super Bowl, his offenses scored 13 points and yet won the game, while all other teams whose offenses scored 13 points or fewer are a combined 0-45 in the big game. Football is a game of context, a game with more variables surrounding any one player than any other, and there is perhaps no better example of just how vicious that context can be, even to an all-time great, than Drew Brees' Saints of the mid-2010s. From 2014 to 2016, Brees led the league in passing yards for 3 straight seasons. He had 102 passing touchdowns, second most in the NFL, a 51.8% passing success rate, the best in the NFL. He led the number 3 offense in that span with just an average run game to support him, by the way. Yet his team went 7-9, then they went 7-9, then they went 7-9 again. You know why? The Saints defense was the worst in the NFL by both yards and points allowed over that period. So what exactly was Brees supposed to do? He was outstanding, and yet his team never even went 500 in that span. His team failed, but their failures were completely out of his control, entirely due to a side of the ball on which he does not play. This is maybe the best example of why wins aren't a quarterback stat. Maybe you hear that saying thrown around a lot, and I firmly believe it to be true. But Super Bowls are really not a quarterback stat. They're an even more flawed measure of a quarterback because of how small the sample size is. Over a large sample size, the best quarterbacks do tend to win a lot of games because they tend to lead to elite offenses. And although they can always be held back by surroundings, a situation like Brees's with that level of defensive incompetence is an extreme example. And over an entire career, things should at least sort of even out, although there are definitely quarterbacks who are just more fortunate than others. But when it comes to a single Super Bowl, well, then you can give Brad Johnson or Trent Dilfer an all-time great defense, and they don't even have to play well for their team to win 3 to 4 straight playoff games, while it only takes a couple bad breaks or being drafted to a subpar organization to wall off a great quarterback. But let me be clear about this. I'm trying to be clear in this video. Simply being a great player does not make a quarterback necessarily broadly blameless in their playoff losses. We can look at the 2 quarterbacks with the most Super Bowl losses without a win, Fran Tarkenton and Jim Kelly, 2 very good quarterbacks who were truly atrocious in those Super Bowls. They were not let down by circumstances. They failed their teams in those games. They were really bad. But if we up the standards to look at the truly all-time great talents, Peyton was a playoff underperformer relative to his regular season standards. The same is true for Dan Marino. And in more recent years, Lamar Jackson, whose best regular seasons have been as good as any quarterback to play the game, has seen his passer rating in the playoffs drop by 18 points and has just 13 total touchdowns against 11 turnovers. He has just 3 playoff wins in spite of the fact that his defense has allowed just 18.6 points per game in the playoff games he's played, even better than that Brady defensive number, because he's led his offense to score just 18.6 points per game. So of course, there are real playoff underperformers. The claim here is not that when a great quarterback loses repeatedly in the playoffs, it can't be his fault. Sometimes it is. And every great quarterback has been at fault in at least one playoff loss. But the label of playoff underperformer is often thrown around much too liberally, solely based on team wins and losses, as opposed to individual performance, when, as we established with the Allen Brees Rodgers exercise earlier, we should be able to isolate quarterback performance from the team result, acknowledging that if a quarterback's playoff numbers are really good and his team offenses perform really well, that quarterback is good in the playoffs, and it's bad process to scramble for ways to blame them simply because their team lost. And even in the case of Marino or Lamar, while they are responsible for their own playoff underachievement, they are nevertheless victims of the brutality of playoff football being an extremely small sample size game. Lamar has undoubtedly underperformed in the playoffs, but he's only played 8 playoff games in his entire career. 8 games. He will have more chances, and I do believe he absolutely can perform better in the playoffs going forward. With how great a player he is, I have to expect that. And for Marino, if he had a stronger supporting cast, specifically a better defense throughout his career, that could have bought him more bites at the apple, more legitimate chances at a Super Bowl. 4 times, he led a top 7 offense and missed the playoffs entirely. So with a 240 game sample size of all-time great regular season performance on Marino's resume, it's hard for me to hold an 18 game sample size of playoff underperformance against him that much, especially when he was frequently working with subpar defenses. It matters, but certainly not as much as all the great stuff he did over a much larger sample size as we look at his resume holistically. The same is true in the opposite direction. A small sample size of strong playoff performance does not simply redefine who a quarterback who was average for the rest of his career was as a player. Which brings us to the other Manning brother, the antithesis of Peyton in some ways. Let's talk about Eli Manning. Eli is as polarizing a quarterback as there is. Over his 16-year regular season career, he consistently hovered as an average to above average quarterback. He was talented, but very mistake prone. No player this century has thrown as many interceptions as Eli. No player this century has lost as many fumbles as Eli. And out of the 45 quarterbacks to attempt at least 3,000 passes this century, Eli ranks 38th in passer rating and 34th in passing success rate. He accrued a lot of career yardage, ranking 11th all-time there, but that was due to strong longevity in an era in which passing offenses were at an all-time high. On a year-to-year basis, his numbers were, well, what I said, average. But in the playoffs, Eli led 2 of the more iconic Super Bowl runs ever, twice leading his underdog Giants to upset the Titanic Patriots, and he legitimately played the best football of his career over those 2 playoff runs. Obviously, Eli deserves an immense amount of credit for his performance over those 2 Super Bowl runs. He played a pivotal role in their reaching the pinnacle of the sport, and that is, of course, the defining accomplishment of his career. But does it fundamentally change who he was as a player? Not really. Did he rise to the occasion in those 2 Super Bowl runs? Absolutely. But did Eli always simply flip a switch when the playoffs came around and magically transform into an elite QB as a mythological big game performer? Not at all. Outside of the 2 Super Bowl runs, Eli was awful in the Giants' other 4 playoff appearances as they got bounced in the first round each time. But nobody remembers that. Maybe it would kill the legend if we spoke of that reality more often, although I don't think it would, because nothing can take away what Eli did in those 2 runs. My point is just that it's not characteristic of who he was as a player over his career, as his regular season resume and even his bottom line playoff numbers show. The 2007 and 2011 Giants were genuinely lightning in a bottle captured twice. Perfect embodiments of complete team synergy, a quarterback and a defense both, quite fortunately, peaking at the right time. Because, lest we forget, magical and incredible as both of Eli's Super Bowl game-winning drives were, they were only made possible by the fact that his defense held 2 all-time great Patriots offenses to 14 and 17 points respectively. The defense was the true hero of both of those games, delivering the truly outstanding performances, while Eli stepped in to make the timely plays we love so much from our quarterbacks. He was certainly clutch, but was he a great quarterback? Was his career overall Hall of Fame caliber? Not at all, but people will fight you tooth and nail on those 2 facts because of the 2 Super Bowls. What Eli's story reflects to me is how much the perception of a quarterback is determined by timing. If you play great as a quarterback, but the group around you sucks, so you lose, your stellar individual performance will likely be forgotten. But if you play well as your entire team excels and you win, your performance as the quarterback will not only be remembered, but perhaps even lionized, romanticized, and celebrated beyond what it actually deserves. Because, of course, your team won. And when a team wins, we all look first to what the quarterback did right. Eli absolutely seized the moment, but the stars also aligned for him to have that moment. And Eli does not control the stars. The truth is that quarterbacks just do not control as much as we'd like to think. They don't draft and sign their offensive lines, running backs, and receivers, nor their defenses. They don't assemble their coaching staffs, nor coach the games themselves. They do not choose where they are drafted. Situation is monumentally important, and they don't determine their situations. We frequently call quarterback the most important position in sports, but a quarterback simply cannot impact the game like the best player on a basketball team, who only shares the floor with 4 other players and who can greatly impact both sides of the ball. Winning a title without the best player on an NBA team is truly unimaginable. But we've seen several teams win a Super Bowl with a backup quarterback. And it seems like every year we see a new quarterback who had previously posted horrific numbers suddenly producing and winning games in a new situation. So much of quarterback performance and perception is about circumstances. The fewer the variables around you, the more control you have as an individual. No sport has more surrounding variables than football. Peak LeBron James could get just about any team ever to 50 plus wins, but drop Patrick Mahomes on the 2025 Chiefs and he can go 6-8. That is the nature of football. But speaking of Mahomes, I'd like to spend a moment praising him because I've barely mentioned him in this video up to this point, and the reason for that is that he's the closest thing to an exception to everything that I've talked about in this video that there is. See, Mahomes' defenses in the playoffs have performed much closer to the Allen, Brees, Rodgers range of the spectrum than to Brady's, and yet he is 17-4 in his playoff career because his team's offenses have scored more points per game in the playoffs than any other great quarterback's teams ever. Already, at just 30 years old, Mahomes has more playoff wins in which his team allowed 29 or more points than any other quarterback in NFL history. The 2023 Chiefs defense was excellent, but Mahomes has won 2 other Super Bowls with defenses that ranked 15th and 21st in regular season points per drive allowed, and he's reached the Super Bowl with 2 more defenses that ranked outside the top 12 in that category. He has perhaps the greatest bottom line per game playoff numbers ever, and repeated nails clutch moments, creating a combination of per game playoff performance that nobody in NFL history can match. This is why if anybody tries to tell you the GOAT debate is over just because Mahomes didn't perform well in 2 Super Bowls, they're wrong. That's a take that lacks perspective. Already, Mahomes has done things Brady never did. The extent to which he has carried his team to Super Bowls is unprecedented. Brady also has lower playoff lows on his resume than Mahomes. He had a remarkable stinker against the Ravens in the 2009 playoffs. And by the way, he played 2 more bad playoff games just against Baltimore just over the next 3 years after that. And even in the Super Bowl, he lost as a 2-touchdown favorite because he and the offense totally underperformed. If you are of the belief Tom Brady never sucked in the playoffs because he has 7 Super Bowls, you are demonstrably wrong. Because of course he did sometimes. That's inevitable. So the same can be said for Mahomes. He's had a couple subpar playoff games, but he is absolutely the greatest per game playoff performer in NFL history. So we don't know if Mahomes is going to be the GOAT, but the conversation is certainly not over. It hasn't really even started yet. Mahomes is just 30. To me, the greatest challenge that Mahomes will face as he tries to make a GOAT case is going to be pushing to match Brady's longevity. not his raw ring total. He doesn't have to win 7 rings to match Brady's case because, I don't know if you've heard, rings are a deeply flawed measure of a quarterback's greatness. So, Mahomes may be the closest thing to an exception to the rule, but even he missed the playoffs entirely this year at 30 years old while healthy for 14 games. In fact, this season overall perfectly proves the overarching point I'm making in this video. The 2025 playoff field was not defined by elite quarterbacks. It was defined more so by the absence of them. Instead, the playoffs were full of the teams that were best coached, with the strongest defenses and the best overall rosters, often with younger, more average quarterbacks. And as we look to the Super Bowl matchup before us, we have Sam Darnold, a good quarterback who just played a phenomenal game against the Rams to get his team to the Super Bowl, but who also led the NFL in turnovers this year, ranked 14th in total EPA, and led an offense that ranked 11th in points per drive. Again, he's good, but certainly not great. Then we have Drake Maye, who absolutely was elite this regular season, but who has struggled mightily individually in these playoffs, taking 15 sacks, a number of which he is responsible for, consistently demonstrating poor pocket feel and awareness, fumbling 6 times, and leading a generally anemic offense. No team has ever scored fewer points through 3 wins to advance to the Super Bowl than the 2025 Patriots. Their playoff offensive numbers look essentially identical to those of the Cleveland Browns this season. One of these quarterbacks is going to win the Super Bowl, and when they do, the same trite narratives will be forced upon us. We'll be told by some that Darnold is a top 5 quarterback, something nobody would consider if his team, with their historic defense, didn't win the Super Bowl, just as we were with Jalen Hurts after last year. And look how that aged. One game should never swing your opinion on a quarterback that violently because it's one game. Or we'll be told that Maye was actually good this entire playoff run, that he always did enough, when it's actually only because of his defense's historic performance against a weak slate of quarterbacks in the AFC playoffs that Maye's team even got to the Super Bowl. And by the way, on the flip side, if the Patriots lose, Maye will probably become underrated because people will overly focus on a down individual postseason up against a full 17-game sample of regular season excellence, for which he should have been rewarded with MVP, in my opinion. Whichever way things end up, the playoffs and Super Bowls tend to lead to toxic, misguided quarterback discourse. Of course, I'm not saying everybody will buy into this Super Bowl-based propaganda, but the contingent that does will be large and loud and wrong. History will be revised because history is told by the victor. And when a team wins, there is usually no bigger winner in terms of reputation than the quarterback. And by the way, I like both of these quarterbacks in the Super Bowl. What I do not like is winning bias and revisionism. All I'm asking is for people to put everything in context, to try to keep a level head, to not just play the quarterback glaze or quarterback blame game based purely on a team result, to analyze all the factors that contribute to that team result and separate individual and team performance. I promise this leads to more honest and accurate discourse, and personally, that's all I'm looking for. Nevertheless, some may ask the question, am I making this video solely to push Josh Allen agendas? No, and I don't even know why you would ask that. But no, I'm really not. It's bigger than that. I swear. Thanks for watching.